October 2025. 3.5 years after invading Ukraine, Russia's war machine is falling apart. Of the more than 4,000 tanks Putin had at the start of the war, most have already turned into scrap metal on the battlefield. And now, in a desperate move, the Kremlin is pulling World War II tanks out of museums to send them back to the front lines. How did the army that once claimed to be the second most powerful in the world reach this point? And why isn't even North Korea's help enough to stop the collapse? Since the beginning of the war, military analysts around the world have been trying to calculate the real cost of the invasion. But one source has become the gold standard: Oryx. This independent platform doesn't work with estimates or rumors. Every lost vehicle, every destroyed tank, is counted only when there is visual proof, a photo or video confirming the loss. That means if Oryx shows a number, you can be sure that piece of equipment truly no longer exists. And the most striking part is that even with such strict verification, the numbers already seem unreal. According to Oryx's database, Russia has lost more than 22,600 military assets. Among them, around 13,000 armored vehicles, from simple troop transports to heavy combat vehicles. And the most painful number for the Kremlin, over 4,100 tanks, the heart of any mechanized army. To put that into perspective, it's as if Moscow had lost the entire armored force of countries like France, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined. And remember, these numbers represent only what has been visually confirmed. Analysts estimate the real total could be 20 to 30% higher, since not every loss is recorded on video. Compared to Ukraine, the contrast is clear. Even fighting against a theoretically superior power, Kiev's forces have lost roughly half of what Russia has. That difference isn't explained by luck or Western equipment alone, but by smarter tactics, better drone coordination, and the surgical use of artillery. And what these numbers reveal is clear. The war is no longer about who has more tanks. It's about who uses best what they still have. The numbers are staggering. But what's even more remarkable is that the Kremlin still tries to sustain the narrative that it has infinite reserves. The idea that Moscow can lose thousands of tanks and simply replace everything with pieces from its so-called Soviet arsenal. But when you look closely, that myth collapses quickly. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS, at the start of the invasion in February 2022, Russia had about 3,300 modern tanks in active service, the T-72, T-80, and T-90 models. That was the core of Russia's armored force, machines combining firepower, armor, and some updated sensor technology. But in less than 3.5 years, most of that arsenal has been reduced to burned-out shells, destroyed, captured, or simply abandoned on the battlefield. That's when Moscow turned to what many now call the Soviet graveyard, the stockpiles of tanks inherited from the Soviet Union. In theory, there were about 17,500 units stored in depots scattered across Russia and Siberia. But what satellite images reveal tells a very different story. Most of those vehicles have been sitting exposed to the elements for decades, with no maintenance, no working engines, no electronics, rust eating through the joints, and barrels literally filled with mud. They are tanks that don't start, don't fire, and in many cases, don't even move. Even so, in 2022, the Kremlin began digging into that arsenal. By May of that year, the first convoys of T-62 tanks, a model designed back in the 1960s, began to appear. They were pulled from storage and rushed to the southern front, especially around the Kherson region. In videos released by Russian soldiers, you could see the vehicles being towed, unable to move on their own. But the real sign of desperation came 2 years later. In November 2024, satellite images revealed something unthinkable: T-34 tanks being pulled out of museums and restored for training purposes. In reality, many of them ended up sent to rear-line areas where they were used as fixed defensive platforms, or as targets, once the Ukrainians discovered their positions. Those T-34 tanks, built during World War II, were once a symbol of Soviet victory in 1945. Now, 70 years later, they have become a symbol of Russia's collapse in 2025. And this is where the crisis takes on a new face. The country that once claimed to have endless stockpiles is now struggling just to keep its factories running. And what does come off the production lines is no longer enough to replace what's lost every single week. If the Kremlin can no longer rely on its old stockpiles, the only alternative would be to build new tanks. But that's where reality hits hard. Russia's defense industry simply can't keep up with the pace of destruction. Today, Russia produces an average of 250 tanks per year, counting both new models and rebuilt units. That might sound like a lot, until you remember that the country has already lost more than 4,100 tanks since the beginning of the war. Even if every factory operated 24 hours a day without a single pause, it would take more than 16 years just to replace what's already been destroyed. And that's assuming Ukraine stopped destroying tanks right now, which is far from the case. These factories aren't new. The main one, Uralvagonzavod, located in Nizhny Tagil, was built back in the Soviet era. It faces shortages of components, a lack of microchips, and major difficulties importing critical materials. After Western sanctions, Moscow has tried to replace Western-made parts with Chinese versions, but they perform worse and often fail in the field. And while new tanks are slow to produce, the old ones aren't easy to restore either. At the start of the war, Russia could refurbish about 120 tanks per month, pulling old models from storage, replacing engines and electronics, and sending them back to the front. But by 2025, that rate had collapsed to just 35 per month. The reason? Simple. The best tanks in storage have already been reactivated. What's left requires far more labor, custom-made parts, and workshop time, and many just aren't worth the effort. In some cases, engineers report spending more time repairing an old tank than building a new one from scratch. The IISS, in its latest report, put it bluntly, Russia will not have enough tanks for effective offensive operations starting in 2026. That doesn't mean Moscow will stop fighting, but it completely changes the nature of the war. Without armored mass, Russia loses the ability to break through enemy lines or advance across open terrain, and is forced to rely solely on artillery, infantry, and suicide drones. In other words, the army that began the war as a mechanized shock force is turning into a static defensive army. And the tank crisis is only the tip of the iceberg. Because when you look at the rest of Russia's war machine, the problem runs much deeper, affecting everything from artillery to the skies. For decades, the pride of the Russian forces was their artillery, the so-called god of war. But today, even that advantage is running out. Russia is firing more shells than it can produce, and the only way to keep its guns active has been by importing ammunition from North Korea. The route is long and risky. It starts in the city of Naejin, in North Korea's far north, crosses the border via the Tumongang Bridge, enters Russia through the Primorsky Krai region, and then travels by train all the way to the front in eastern Ukraine. A constant flow of wooden crates, stamped with Korean characters, supplying what's left of Russia's artillery. The irony is brutal. The so-called military superpower that once claimed to be self-sufficient is now dependent on one of the most isolated and heavily sanctioned countries on the planet. And the worst part is that most of the ammunition arriving is old, unstable, and inaccurate. Field reports indicate a failure rate of up to 20%, with shells that either fail to detonate or explode prematurely. In many sectors, Russian gunners are even separating the more reliable batches to avoid accidents, a silent admission that the quality of their munitions has dropped dramatically. But if the situation on the ground is critical, in the air it's even more alarming. The crisis in Russian aviation has reached the point where the country has been forced to cannibalize civilian aircraft, dismantling commercial planes to extract parts for use in fighter jets and bombers. According to a report by the RAND Corporation, the Russian Air Force is currently operating at less than 75% of its original capacity. For every 4 aircraft, 1 is permanently out of operation due to lack of maintenance, electronic components, or engines. And the math is cruel here too. Russia can produce about 25 new aircraft per year while losing an average of 60 due to wear, accidents, or combat. That means the air fleet keeps shrinking every year, and the technological gap keeps growing. Stocks of modern air-to-air missiles like the R-77 and the R-37M are also running out, forcing the use of outdated Soviet-era models from the 1980s. The result is clear: fewer fighters on patrol, fewer precision strikes, and an air force that no longer dictates the pace of the war. It merely reacts. 3.5 years after the invasion began, what was once called the Russian war machine has turned into an exhausted body held together by improvisation and propaganda. Tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft, and artillery, everything is wearing out faster than it can be replaced. Industry can't keep up. North Korea supplies faulty ammunition. Factories run on recycled parts, and even civilian planes are being cannibalized just to keep a few fighters in the air. It's the portrait of a superpower that burned its own future on the battlefield. This is the perfect storm: a crisis of equipment, a crisis of ammunition, a crisis of manpower, and a crisis of economy. Human losses have already climbed into the hundreds of thousands. The shortage of military engineers is now compromising even the maintenance of basic systems. And on the financial front, the picture is just as bleak. With oil and gas exports declining and military spending consuming nearly half of the federal budget, Russia is literally trading economic stability for a few more days of war. Putin now faces 3 doors, and none lead to victory. The first is to pull back, slow down the war, preserve what's left of the army, but risk appearing weak, something the regime cannot tolerate. The second is to push on, keep spending men and machines to the limit, driving the country into total exhaustion and turning the army into a poorly equipped infantry force. And the third is to negotiate, look for a diplomatic way out. But inside the Kremlin, that would sound like defeat. And for Putin, defeat could mark the beginning of the end. As the world watches, Russia's future narrows between these 3 choices. And the question that remains is simple: what will Moscow sacrifice first? Its tanks, its economy, or the regime itself? In the end, what remains is an image that captures the entire war: an endless road covered with the burned-out carcasses of tanks, symbols of an ambition lost among smoke, steel, and pride. But the collapse of Russia's war machine isn't the end of the story. While its tanks burn in Ukraine, the Kremlin has already opened another front, a war not fought only with weapons, but with sabotage, espionage, and veiled threats. And the new target is Germany. Behind the scenes, Moscow has been testing NATO's limits: provocative flyovers, submarine attacks, satellites, shifting orbit, and maneuvers that echo the days leading up to the invasion of Ukraine. Only this time, the battlefield is much larger. Click now on the video appearing on your screen and see how Russia is setting the stage for something that could redefine Europe's military balance, and why Germany may be the next major battleground in a war that's no longer just about Ukraine.